Good afternoon from a sunny Toronto, Canada. Today, eMHIC friends. And so I got my globe with me today. This is one of the globes that we've used in our recent New York event, and you'll hear a little bit about that as time goes on. And my guests today are coming in from Norway and Ottawa. And our headquarters are in New Zealand. So, the globe is very important when we think about conversations like this. And so, welcome to our eMHIC Fireside Chat. I'm Nicole Waldron, and it is truly a pleasure to be your host this afternoon. And I'm so glad you can join us for this conversation. The topic: authenticity over algorithms, why real stories matter in mental health. Now, I think we can all agree that this topic is especially relevant right now. We're constantly surrounded by stories online, but so many of them have been shaped, shortened, filtered, and carefully packaged for attention. A lot of the stories we see seem more about performance or persuasion than the actual human experience underneath. And because of that, something resonates deeply within us when we hear someone speak honestly about their lived experience. It is especially powerful when it's their own words, with all the little contradictions and imperfections still there, like our conversation today. Because that's what makes someone feel human and relatable. Real storytelling has a way of making us pause. It helps us soften our judgment of one another. It reminds us of our shared humanity. And it also helps us to understand mental health in a much deeper way than labels or statistics ever can. So today we're going to explore the difference between storytelling and narrative building. We'll talk about the impact of algorithms and digital culture are having on stories we see, and why lived experience voices still often sit outside traditional ideas of expertise. We'll also talk about leadership, system change, dignity in storytelling, and the responsibility we all have when sharing experiences of others. Now, I have been really looking forward to this conversation, as I know Haley and Jimmy, and they are phenomenal individuals. And they have spent years creating spaces for people to tell their stories in a way that helps people to be seen, heard, and understood, and help them to not feel alone as they share their stories. Now, what I'm liking right now, I can see we have some eMHIC people in the house because you're already starting to share where you're from. I see Dublin, I see the USA, I see the UK. Oh, I'm loving. So in the chat, if you're new to our eMHIC webinars, you got to tell us where you're from. I see Nottingham. Wow, this is so good. And remember to put your questions in the question and answer box, the Q&A box, and I will try my best to bring those questions to light. Today's session will be recorded, and our eMHIC team will make sure that the recording is available shortly in our eMHIC Knowledge Bank. Now remember, you got to sign up and be a part of our eMHIC family. It's not going to be posted on LinkedIn or any of those platforms. It is really specific to eMHIC and the eMHIC family. Now, it's time to get to our guests. Our first one up will be Haley Hitchman, and she is a mental health leader, storyteller, and advocate for lived experience-driven programming. As executive director of Unsinkable, she works to create more human, connected approaches to mental health through authentic storytelling and community engagement. Give it up for Haley in the chat. Give her your emojis. And coming up with her is Jimmy Westenheim, and he is the founder of the Human Aspect Foundation and creator of Life Experience Library. Through storytelling, his work explores human connection, challenges, stigma, and labels, and creates space for people to have to share their lived experience with honesty and depth. Jimmy, come on up to the eMHIC stage. This is my clapping thing for today. And he's going to come through backstage. We're using webinars, so you have to come through backstage, come on stage, and we're going to have a great discussion. So glad to have you both here. The last time I saw you both was when we did our eMHIC conference in Toronto in November of 2025. So it's good to see you guys. I wish we were live, but I guess the time zone thing. Jimmy, it's like 8 something, 8:30 in Norway. And Haley, well, you're on the same time zone with me, so we're cool. Jamie, we're keeping you up tonight. And oh, I see Australia has joined us in the house. So, Haley, I'm going to start with you. Unsinkable work is deeply rooted in authentic storytelling and lived experience. What do you think changes when someone shares their story in their own words, with all the nuance, contradiction, and humanity still intact?
Thanks, Nicole. What a great question. As you mentioned, I'm Haley. I am the executive director at Unsinkable, and our whole focus is on the healing power of personal story and how we can, through sharing our stories, create spaces where one person's story can become a lifeline for others. And when I think about the value of first person storytelling from someone's own lived experience, from their own perspective, I think about two things. The first thing is the meaning making that comes for the storyteller themselves, of just being able to work through your own story. There's so much self understanding, there's an opportunity to see your experiences differently. And for the audience, there's this chance to see your experience mirrored back at you through someone else's eyes. And it's very hard to do that if it's not through context and nuance and authenticity. The thing we connect to most deeply in someone else's story is the emotional undertone. It's, the imperfections, it's the struggles that they've had and the choices that they've made and the, mistakes that they've learned through along the way. That's the thing that feels inherently human. And that's the thing that when we listen to someone else's story, we watch someone's story, we read someone's story, that's the thing that helps us feel seen and feel less alone. And so when stories are overly polished or they're lacking that nuance or they're out of context or they're clipped into these little pieces like we often see on social media, we lose that chance to really fully see ourselves reflected back through that person's experience because no one's experience is about one thing or is one dimensional or is a timestamp in a moment. Everyone's story has this complexity and richness and learning and downfall and hope and joy. And so that's the thing that I feel is so important when we're supporting someone to share their story is that we're giving them space to be fully human. And that's the thing that audiences most connect with.
Giving them space to be fully human. Somebody needs to hashtag that. Quote Haley. Put it on our Instagram. Tag email because that was really good. Like I'm saying, if you get a takeaway today, drop it in our social media, hashtag it, and because that was really good, Haley. I think I'm gonna have to put on my voice recorder even just to tape some of what's gonna be happening here today. Jimmy, I'm gonna come to you. Now, the human aspect. You guys have created a space for thousands of people to share deeply personal experiences. What have you learned about the human connection through listening to real stories without trying to simplify or reshape them? Like, as we were talking about earlier, like the algorithms, like the social media platforms do.
I think one of the most important things I've learned, Nicole, is of course the power of authenticity when it can actually flow organic. When I started the Human Aspect 10 years ago, of course, one of the first things we were challenged with when we started publishing the library was you're never going to get people to listen to this because it's too long, it's too this, it's too that. It doesn't match the algorithms. The algorithms was already back then controlling the narrative. If you asked consultants or people that was kind of social media experts to tell you what to do, but also the digital people that was trying to support us. But then the beauty was we stuck with it, and we also said that any conversation needs to be the length that it is. So when we do in-depth interviews with people, and we've done, and I've done more than 850 now from more than 100 countries, is that we allow the conversation to naturally flow. So some of them are 35 minutes, that's some of the shortest ones, and the longest ones are 90 minutes. And that's edited version. So that means it's hours we're talking about in the original version. And then when we had launched it and published it, it's been out for a couple of years. That's where we saw that the people that actually entered from a snippet, of course, in social media into the full versions, close to 50% of the people that entered it finished the long format. over several years in several countries, kind of just throwing that assumption out of the window. So I think the power of authenticity is that it can also outcompete the algorithm in itself. So what I learned from that is that the power of someone's story isn't to shape it to the format or to the fora where you're gonna use it. It's actually to allow it to be organic, and that can actually then win the battle. So I think the most beautiful thing from that lesson was seeing that the actual authenticity of someone's uniqueness, and that obviously will have different lengths when it's shared in a story, is actually what people really want, because we were out competing all the people that gave me advice eventually. So that was kind of fun.
You know, you hit the nail on the head for me because I remember when I started my podcast, that was my thing. I was like, people, if you stay for the hour, if it ends up 2 hours, that's okay. Because don't we sit and watch a movie for like 2 hours or an hour and a half? But we are telling real stories in real time, and people are sharing their real lived experiences. And what more can someone identify with when something is not made up? It's human, and if you make mistakes along the way, if you say something that is it's okay because we are human beings living a human life, having this human experience, and life is lifing all the time. So I appreciate what the two of you have said as we've opened that power of keeping it organic. And you know, let me think here, because this conversation is going to be rich, guys. So we have some questions, but I know we're going to be weaving in and out of this like a beautiful quilt. Yes, a beautiful quilt, and like this beautiful world that I have in my hand here today. How, Haley, how can storytelling help people better understand or shift the internal narratives they carry about themselves? You kind of touched on that in the beginning about the stories we tell ourselves and how it mirrors um, back to one another. So, if you can share a little bit about that, would be great.
Yeah, so we often talk about the most important stories are the ones that we tell ourselves. And
Mm,
so much of that comes from, you know, I'm sure everyone in this room can relate to there's a way that you felt about something to do with yourself. Maybe it's your personality, maybe it's something to do with the way you look, maybe it's a situation that you've been in that if you listen really, really closely, it's usually someone else's voice who is telling you that story. Maybe it's a parent, maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was someone telling you you're not good enough or this possibility isn't available to you or this is all you can expect from this situation. We don't always recognize in the moment how many of the elements of shame or guilt or negative emotions towards ourselves, that inner voice that's very critical, how much of that comes from the other people in our life and often comes from really formative moments in our life, maybe ones that we remember, maybe ones that are much more distant from our memory at the moment. But there's this internalized element that happens to our story over time, that the more and more deeply ingrained that part of our story becomes, the more and more it starts to sound like our own voice. And so going through the process of looking at your story and building backwards and seeing where did that thought about myself come from and being able to do some of that self-examination is such a powerful way of better understanding ourselves and also letting go of the shame that we often hold on to through those stories. It's a way for us to see, okay, what do I truly believe about myself and what is actually something that's put on me by society, by, others in my life, by these moments and interactions that I've had. What do I want to rewrite and turn into a new story? What do I want to hold with me because it feels true and maybe it's something I need to work on? And what can I just let go and move on from? Because I think for even for myself, there's been so many moments throughout my life where I've had to sit for a second. You have those little instances where you have this very loud critical voice that's telling you like, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this.
right.
And when you stay quiet and you give yourself a moment to really work through that story, whether it's writing, whether it's taking some time to journal, there's lots of different ways that you can start that process without sharing your story publicly. But when you do that, I've even found, for myself along the way, I've identified all these voices that I hadn't really thought about in a long time, like little micro moments throughout your life
Mm,
where someone told you something. Um, And so for me, the ways in which we support people to tell their story, the ways that we encourage self-reflection and self-analysis, the way that we encourage conversation around where your story comes from versus taking it all at face value is so important because, even the way we look at a story about ourselves from 5 years ago and the way we process it, the exact same situation 5 years from now will be different because we have the power of insight and perspective. And so storytelling is not just a form of external value that we're giving to community and audiences and other people to absorb. It's also something that we're able to give to ourselves.
I love the way how you frame that, Haley. And, as I listen to you, it's giving the permission to be you, but it's also understanding who you are and where influences have come up in your life. And Jimmy, I know you want to say something. Come on in.
Yep, I really want to build further on that because if you lean into psychology, we know that how can a human being be authentic? There's a lot of psychological theories behind that, and one of them is the famous Johari's window. It's the different four ways that a human being sees themselves and the world sees you, right? So there's one square, which is the authentic square, which is the square where everyone sees the same. This is the way you see yourself. This is the way people see you from the outside. And there's a square that is how people see you, but that's how you don't see yourself. A funny example of that is if you record yourself and listen to your own voice, you go like, oh my God, is this that way I sound? Because it's always different between the
Yes.
way people listen to you and the way that you hear yourself, right?
Yeah.
Fun fact about that, since I'm a podcast host and I've heard myself way too much, that actually self-corrects eventually. So now I hear myself the same way as others do. That's another side. And then, of course, it's the other side, the way you see yourself that Haley spoke about, that inner voice that other people don't see. They might see
Right.
someone confident, but you might be talking yourself down. It's a beautiful example,
Right.
right? And then there's the little square, which is how you deal with crisis. This is something you don't know before you face something, and then you will see new sides of yourself. But the beauty is if you do exercises with bringing your inner self out by being vulnerable using storytelling, you move it from the box, which is mine, hidden, no one knows, to the box of everyone, moving it into authenticity. And the same if you ask people to share how they see you and you're open for that perspective, for example, being kind of talking about privileges or, prejudices and these kinds of things, you're also moving that into, again, the authenticity. And if you go through tough things in life and you reflect on them, lived experience, what we do in human aspect, you also shift that into it. So it's really interesting to see that storytelling is a massive block of making yourself authentic. And it's actually being used pretty like strategically, you could say, or very systematic in psychological therapeutical work. So I wanted to kind of add that in there as well to
That
strengthen
was a great
her point.
that was a great added. And I think everybody's going to be now searching up what you said just did, Jimmy. Everybody's going to go look for the Joharius window. So you're going to have to put that in the chat there, Jimmy, because I know people are going to be looking that up. And if we recognize most speakers, regardless of what they're talking on, any great speaker always incorporates storytelling in their speaking. So it's so important. And just before I jump into the other question, I see Rafaela, you had a question in the chat talking about the algorithms and also being worried about um, chopping things up and when to hear it, and I think that's what Jimmy just spoke to earlier. And the key is, I would say to you, even just coming out of a podcast conference last week, it's your why. Why are you sharing your stories on the podcast? Because if you worry about the numbers and the algorithms, it will have you hopping all over the place. You have to be authentic to yourself and then learn how to use the tools that are out there like YouTube Shorts. Take the shorts and take some clips and then bring people back to your long story. People who are really interested in it will come back. But when you're authentic about what you're doing and why you're doing it, it is going to blossom, totally blossom. Jimmy?
love to hear what Haley has to say about this as well after this. But if I use the 10 years, Human Aspect have had more than 250 million reach and 150 million views or something like that in social media in the last 10 years. So if you utilize our own statistics, which people, as I said earlier, spoke down, they said that this is impossible. You won't be able to compete with the other things in the algorithm, so in the social media world. But historically, we have had 50% engagement on all our posts, which is, if you speak to someone working in social media, that's madness. And the reason why we have had it is that, directly to your question, we separated two things. One is what Nicole spoke about now, the why. Why are you making it? What is the core in what you want to bring the content? Because you said that we all have a voice, we want it to be heard. What if no one is listening? That is linked to the why. Like, do someone need to listen? Does it need to be 10? Does it need to be 10,000? It doesn't matter. So, but on the other side, how do you utilize the biggest social media or the biggest marketing tool in history, which social media is, to your advantage? For us, we realized that was two separate things. So we brought all the experts in, we learned and we understood how the algorithms functioned. And of course, we started using our own data and our own analysis eventually to utilize how to get our stories out, but still our stories. We never allowed those shaping how we decided the stories to look like. But again, of course, you utilize them to make sure that you reach out. But one of the dilemmas that we reached, which was something we took a very value-based stand on, was, for example, you can go clickbait, right? We have dramatic stories about surviving torture, discrimination, rape, like all kinds of things, where you obviously can have very dramatic starts to the clips.
Right.
And we decided against it, and we said that we don't want clickbait starts because it defeats the purpose. Because if someone jumps and just sees 5 seconds, which obviously a lot of people do, of your content, we are literally contributing to something negative. You're giving them negative emotions. But we had dramatic starts still, but dramatic in terms of vulnerability, being authentic. And then we saw that pulled them in, and then comes the dramatic part in the short clip a little bit later to keep them on to the next level, because we knew that you need a second spike to get people into your 2-3 minutes. And then came the lessons and the other things in the end. So that's how we separated those two. And we then didn't care about the numbers. Some of our videos have millions of views and other videos have a few hundred views, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the same impact, because if the ones that the full story actually hit, that's the same value in the end, which was important for us, because we could have got lost. And I'm curious to hear what Haley has to say as well on lifting up other people's story, because it's a big responsibility that we have.
Yeah, I think for us, a bit, and very similar to what you were saying, Jimmy, the focus has been on the ethics of storytelling as well, of making sure that if we're working with someone, A, what is their level of readiness to share certain parts of their story? Because often with the algorithm, so much of what gets recognized and amplified are the things that are like really shocking or glorified or that bring people in a moment. However, we always see what is the importance that we play in showing dignity to someone's story, to showing them as a whole person, rather than this kind of little bits and pieces of who they are disconnected from the greater whole. Because that doesn't serve, it doesn't serve their story, because ultimately they're so much more complex and multifaceted than that. And it doesn't really serve the audience, because we're just then leaning into this passive consumption. And one of our focuses is lean away from passive consumption, lead towards active engagement. So even when it is much easier for us to create all of these little clip pieces, we try to be really intentional not to do that. We'll still use learnings. That is definitely an area where we feel that having, smaller clips from a story can be really helpful to bring someone in and direct them to a longer version of a story. So what was a piece of learning or a piece of advice that someone has taken, versus breaking their actual story and their experience down into these micro moments? It's how do we use an insight that they brought to the table or a recommendation or something that supported them as the draw point for someone who might be finding this story on social media and encourage them to go actually interact with the full human experience that someone has. The other piece for us is that we always offer a storyteller the option to share their story in whatever modality feels most comfortable to them. So not, all our stories take on a variety of different modalities, whether that's in writing, whether it's poetry, whether it's a video, whether it's spoken on a stage, whether it's audio. There's all lots of different ways for people to share story. And so being really mindful that one form of storytelling doesn't work for everyone and not everyone feels comfortable, sharing their story, in front of a camera on a screen, recording a video. But what are other ways that we can repurpose some of the lessons, say, from a written story on social that give some insight and context and then bring someone to that full article that storyteller put together, and just having them part of that process is so important for us. The other piece I'll say is that we've advocated for longer form storytelling in situations where we've been encouraged to kind of cut something down into these micro clips. And what we've always seen is that the level of engagement, like you mentioned, Jimmy, is a lot higher on some of those than you would expect because you're reaching the right people. And I think there's so much focus on vanity metrics of like how many people and what was the reach. But ultimately, if you're giving context to a story, if you're really allowing someone to sit with it, if you're giving them tools to process and connect, you'll find the right people who need to see it in that moment. And even if the views are less, even if, you're not, going viral in these spaces, we get so many messages from people from those longer form videos that may have seen less people but really impacted them in a personal way of, I saw myself in this person. I feel really grateful that I got to watch this video or hear about their story. And that's the thing that we carry with us, and that's the thing we'll always continue to put more effort into is the long-term impact versus the more immediate reward. Because our goal, and I'm sure like with yourself, Jimmy, through the work at the human aspect, our goal is to create a ripple effect. Our goal is to really truly transform people's understanding of themselves, to create empathy, to encourage conversation and community. And the only way that we do that is if we give people the tools. And the only way to give people the tools is to really tell a human story in a way that is compelling and connecting versus this kind of quick hit that you see a lot on social media.
So unpacking that is that's really good there. And I'm thinking of when we talk about storytelling versus narrative telling and bringing the mental health aspect into it. Like today, we're surrounded by so many narratives that often shape the outcome, the audience, and the algorithms. So when you think about it, can you see a distinction between storytelling and narrative telling? And I'm putting this to both of you. And that distinction, why does it matter even when we think about mental health, our mental health conversations? Go ahead, Haley.
Sure, I can jump into that. So
You're
You're
on mute,
muted.
Haley. You muted yourself by accident.
there we go. No, thank you. This is a great question. I was thinking a lot about the distinction between the two. And from my perspective, storytelling, in at least in how I see it in our work and the way that it shows up, should always be from a first person account of someone's personal experience. It's about honesty and authentic expression without an agenda or pretense or a goal for what you want someone to take from that story. It gives the audience an opportunity to interpret how they feel about someone's personal story and putting themselves in the shoe of the storyteller and being able to make meaning for themselves versus when I think about that kind of narrative framing, narrative telling, it's coming from a place where you have a very specific agenda around how you want someone to be perceived, often with an outcome in mind of what you want an audience to take away. It's more targeted around how you want someone to walk away feeling. And that's where I feel like so many harmful narratives come from, is when we want to elicit a certain reaction. And oftentimes, the difference between the two is storytelling is created with and for community and for the storyteller, for them to see themselves expressed versus narrative telling is often told about people. It's, I want a community to be perceived this way, therefore, here is the narrative around their intentions, their motivations, where they may be going with their focus, with their goals, versus this idea of the interpretation is up to the audience. And story is never meant to be with this goal of having someone's experience kind of mapped out into a specific outcome. It's really about artistic expression, about giving people space to be honest, about being able to see yourself mirrored, but also take away different things. Like that's why even if someone's lived experience is dramatically different from our own, that's why you can connect to something real in someone's story because you see yourself in them. Even if you have a lot of different scenarios that you've been through, the emotional undertone is there versus a narrative telling is designed to make you feel a certain way about someone and or about a community or about a specific topic. Um, and from my perspective, when I think about how this affects mental health, so often we're telling stories about people, even in a well-intentioned way, even when organizations are doing impact storytelling. They're saying, this person came to us and they were struggling and now they're doing so much better. Congratulations, we've done so great. Here's the story of how we helped them. There's still an intention there of you take away positive feelings about the organization. They're so great. They've been able to provide this support versus the framing being around here's a full person, here's who they are, and here's how this organization or this support has been part of their journey. So when it can be well intentioned, it can be not so well intentioned, but the goal is the defining factor versus with a story, it's really about that person being able to, or that community being able to share a piece of themselves with the audience.
And where this gets really mushy is where, of course, we now moved into the power of influencer marketing, right? So
Right.
when ordinary human beings, in the sense of being ordinary, that you weren't a sports star or a musician or the quote unquote celebrity, which was the influencers of our time, right? Before social media.
Right.
Then suddenly now a so-called ordinary human being, which of course has grown on social media now, maybe through their story as well. But as Haley is saying, once you kind of shift over from being authentic, maybe that's how your voice was heard in the beginning. You wrote original blog post, maybe you shared about your condition, something you went through, you were vulnerable and open. And then suddenly you become professional, and then you have 500,000 followers or a million or whatever. And then you get all the same advice that I got for the human aspect in the beginning. You start shifting that into narrative telling. And I can literally hear it. That's because obviously I have interviewed a lot of people and heard a lot of stories, and I'm sure Haley is similar. So they might talk from an I perspective still, but it's still a narrative. There's an underlying tone of pushing a brand, for example. There's an underlying tone of pushing something you have created. That, like, again, you are now a marketing tool. You're not a human being anymore in the same way, just sharing a story. And I've seen organizations do the same, similar to what Haley mentioned now, is that you use a so-called influencer to talk up you and your organization. It's incredibly unauthentic. And for me, I've called it the human aspect moments. So it's when I'm sitting in front of another human being that is now sharing their journey organically, dynamically with me. We have created this trust-based area where we're doing the interviews, because of course we do all the interviews face to face with these people where they're sharing, and I've shared my own story as well, of course, which you need to feel the other side. And when they're saying something that you can hear is coming straight from their mind, it's not processed. I'm asking a question and the answer just comes. I get
Organically.
this little
Yeah.
goosebumps
Yeah.
because you can hear that it's authentic. There's something in the tone of voice that is different from when someone has rehearsed something and when someone is just saying something straight from the heart. And for me, that is the difference. That also what I genuinely believe is why the human aspect and Unsinkable is doing well in the same algorithmic ocean, is because the audience actually can hear the same. Maybe they can't explain it in the same way I do because I've thought a little bit too much about it, but they still can hear it. And that for me is the massive difference between the two. The second you start rehearsing even your own story, I've shared my own lived experience story, maybe, I'm not joking if I said I've shared it more than 1,000 times.
Right.
And I realized at the moment where I was sharing it too often in the same order that it shifted from authentic storytelling to narrative telling. And I wasn't in it anymore. I was performing, and I was performing well on stage, if I can say it myself. But then I realized this isn't what I want. So I started then changing the order on my own talk to mess up my own mind so that I wasn't able to do the narrative telling. Because then if you shift the order when you share, you open up a different story, you start in the middle, in the end, and then you go back, you're forcing your brain to share your own story authentically. So if there's anyone listening here which have to share their story quite often through their work, that might be a beautiful tool to ensure as well that your story, when you're sharing it again and again and again, stays authentic, because that's actually quite hard, and you don't do it on purpose. You're doing it to protect yourself and to automate the process, right? To be better at performing. But better at performing isn't what makes it authentic.
So, so rich, so good, what you've both said. And, um, you know, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna kind of reverse engineer it a little bit. Even when Jimmy, you spoke about when you're sharing your story and when you have to tell it differently. And I say to folks, when you have to share, because we're all sharing our stories here. Remember, I go back to remember your why. Think about your why as to what Jimmy said, and think about your audience. What do you really want your audience to get from your story? Because whenever you're going to share your story, know who you're sharing as much as possible, who you're sharing your story to. And that can help you in re-engineering and reverse engineering your story in a way that you also keep it authentic. And when I think about and I'm looking at the questions in the chat, I'm listening to what you're saying, and even having my story most recently shared by an organization. Um, and they worked really hard to keep it authentic so that it wasn't narrative, even though it had an intention behind it. And what I did as the subject, as the person whose story was shared, I went back and intentionally, when I shared the story, I told folks why I shared the story in my sharing of the story. So I didn't just leave it up to the organization. I think this is where we have a responsibility when others use our story or utilize, I don't like to say use, utilize our stories. We have to remember why we said yes, and then what do we want our audience to get from it. And so I ask you, based on what you just shared there, like what advice would you have? Because I'm seeing organizations in the chat having questions around this. What advice would you have based on what we just discussed to helping and ensuring that you keep the stories that you share, especially of those, as we talk about mental health, authentic, even when you need to use it or utilize it in a space, whether it's to raise funds or it's to bring awareness about mental health and wellness, because we are in the mental health and wellness space, and stories is what is making the difference. It's shifting the narrative. So what advice, when we talk about whether you're engaging them in conferences, engaging them to come and do speaks, engaging them in decision making? Jimmy, I know this one, we might, by the time we're done this one, I don't know what other question we're gonna ask, because this one it's gonna take us down the rabbit hole. Go, Jimmy, go.
I will make my best to try to be a little bit shorter on that, but yes. So I think one of the things I want to challenge you a little bit on that as well, Nicole, is if we have an organization is sharing someone else's story,
Mhm.
if you first capture the story authentically, which is what we do, there
Right.
is no other idea behind this story than just asking people. The three core parts of our human aspect interviews is what has been your life's toughest challenge?
Mm.
What has been your journey beyond out it, how to learn to live with it, call it what you want, the journey, how things got better, and what are the lessons and reflections that you have. And the reason why that was important was that in the beginning, we were, of course, doing a little bit of research of the different people. Maybe we found people who have shared in a podcast, an article. We didn't just randomly pick people off the street. In the beginning we did, but then eventually we moved to understanding that people were ready to share their story, as Haley spoke about earlier, that responsibility. And to share why it's important to have that open question, I will utilize Lucas, who shared his story. The reason why we had reached out, we knew he had lost his brother. He was an innocent bystander to a gang shooting in the UK. That's why we called him in. But we always ask open questions. So there's maybe 100 questions in those 3 parts, but I asked them, what has been your life's toughest challenge? We started talking about his relationship with his brother because I needed to build that up. That was part of the story, right? And then eventually, in the middle, he says something. Probably going to get goosebumps again. Because I kept asking him, like, what was your life's toughest challenge? Like, how was this? And then he just looked down, and then he looked at me, and then he said, I guess it's time to say what has been my life's toughest challenge. Because it wasn't losing his brother. And then you could hear that this was the first time he had said this out loud, where he said, I was abused as a child. And then, the room just stood still. So again, if you are an organization and you think you know what they're going to talk about, but you are actually just part of the journey. You were never part of the problem, most likely, if you're an organization that has offered some form of help, right? So ensure that you're allowing them to answer the open questions. Don't close it. Don't think you know why they came to you as an organization, even though they have told you sometime, because it might not be the honest answer. They might have come to you because of alcohol problem, but why did you start having an alcohol problem? It
What
doesn't
was
come
that
out of
root?
nowhere.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
So I think if you're able to allow the recording and the capturing of the story to stay authentic and organic and dynamic and through open questions, once you have captured the story, this is where you can utilize all the lessons about how are we going to portray that story to achieve our objective. Is that objective is to spread your services, donations, whatever the objective is. That's how I think you keep the story authentic. Because if you have that in the back of your mind when you're doing the interview, and I've seen this so many times when we're giving people advice on things that organizations have made, this is where people step wrong. You're making something you think the audience want to hear instead of giving the audience an authentic story that just happens to have you as part of the solution authentically, not in a forced way of asking the question, oh, how did we help you? It's an irrelevant question because already you're putting bias in my head. Now you already told me that you helped me, even though probably you did. Don't put that in the head of someone because they're going to give you the answer they think you want to hear, and it's not authentic answer. So I think
That's
that is
good.
a very important element to bring into when we deal with people's lived experience. Don't put words in their mouth and have these open questions, because that's where you will get the magic that both outcompetes the algorithm, but also ensures that you're uplifting their story, not your version of their story.
And also, Jimmy, as I heard you say that, and Kaylee, I'm going to come to you. As I heard you say that, even as you're the person sharing the story, be careful that you're not also telling the story that you think they want to hear, and you're not being your authentic self. That's what I also heard, as the person sharing their story. I really love that, Jimmy. Haley, you're up.
Yeah, those were great, great points. I would add to that, when, first of all, I think with anything, with any story that we're sharing, especially someone's lived experience, it's so critical that we ask why. What is the intention, to what purpose, for what end? Because if you are, say, for example, incorporating someone's story into impact reporting or into fundraising efforts like that were mentioned, is it their story? Or is it the experience of the organization that is important to emphasize? Like, how are you going to be using their story respectfully? What is the consent process to someone? How are they participating in the development of the story? What role do they play in how the story is presented? Do they get to look at drafts of it? Like, there needs to be a co-creation element if someone's personal story is going to be included in any of your kind of materials as an organization. It's a little bit different for us because our core mission is story. So we're not using a story as part of something else. Our platform is a space for people to share stories. So it's a little bit different than, say, a housing provider or a shelter or a community health space sharing stories of impact about the work that they do. And we've provided some insight to organizations who are going through that process just about the importance of really getting clear on, is it their personal story that you're looking to share, or is it a testimonial? Because we get very explicitly different consent for people for testimonials. We say, we will never use your personal story in fundraising campaigns, in those, in different organizational awareness and amplification. We will, however, request a testimonial if you feel comfortable about what your experience was like and why you decided to share your story with us and how it impacted you. Those are all pieces that I think are really helpful to include in your promotional materials or to connect with, potential supporters or storytellers or participants, clients of a program. But that's a very different way of approaching it versus sharing someone's personal story connected to an organization. So I think it's just knowing the difference between those two things. Are you looking at someone's story, or are you looking at a testimonial towards your work? And that should be shaped very differently. Um, the other piece I think about a lot, and it comes to the question around leadership and lived experience, is your own stories from within an organization. You don't, like, as, say, an organization working in mental health, I often think we miss out on the chance to share our own stories behind the work. So, from your team, from your leadership, from the people within the organization, why do you do this work? What shapes you? What has changed you? Why do you continue to come day after day? Why did you choose to go into this field? Those stories are also really powerful. And so, being able to look internally and ask yourself, if you're a frontline worker, if you're a manager, if you're a leader in an organization, are you comfortable sharing your story? And if you're not, what are some of the factors that are impacting your level of comfort? Because if you're asking someone else to do it, it's a very it's an important reflection to why you wouldn't be open and willing to do it yourself. And so for our team at Unsinkable, almost all of our team members have shared their story. A lot of our board members, Silken as our founder, myself, I came to Unsinkable as a storyteller before I took on this role. So being able to model that is an important step. And oftentimes, if we have a storyteller or a partner that I'm connecting with for the first time, I'll send them my story so that they know a bit about me. So it takes away that power differential that here's who I am, here's a bit about my lived experience, and that there's a reciprocal exchange versus this kind of one-way request for someone to put their story out on the table. So modeling is so critical as we invite people to share, that we share back.
I love that you ask them to get uncomfortable and get comfortable with being uncomfortable, sharing their stories, because we're asking people to do a lot of things that we are not comfortable doing, and especially in this mental health space. The one part I would love the two of you to touch on again is the fact when we have caregivers or people dealing with their lived experience with their mental health and wellness, and it's been compromised and they've had to go through some significant journeys, and they get invited to speak. And what advice? I need that advice out there that you need to give to companies. It would be good for companies to have as to where you position them. And, sometimes they're placed in really interesting places. And I know, we've had that conversation. And Jimmy and Haley, I'm gonna just let you roll on that piece there, on because that's part of the dignity conversation of the dignity in conversations. It's one thing to have me come and tell my story, but how you treat me and the environment you put me in also speaks to that. So, Jimmy, I see you're ready.
I'm ready indeed. And I think this challenging conversation about competency has kind of gone the wrong way, because we
Oh.
have then in these conferences and these spaces, as you said, lived experience has fought for their space. And
Hmm.
the problem of fighting for your space is that you're just eventually put on your space. You're not put with the others in that sense, right? So lived experience is a tick box at the moment. And sometimes you need to fight for your space to be a tick box because that's how you get on stage at all, right? But eventually we need to move beyond being the tick box. And I think we have reached that point a long time ago. And if you look at academia, what is academia? Academia is based on people's stories. Research is data points based on people's experiences. It's in-depth, different kinds of empathy, right? That is in the research. So everything is stories. Everything is human beings. So saying, for example, that your academic background, which is based on books or data or research, based on storytelling, is more valuable than someone's lived experience on the same topic is ludicrous to me. And then, of course, there is a big difference between just have experiencing one thing, your version of, for example, depression, next of kin, caretaker, whatever it is, and being able to uplift from your story to the next level. So if you are at that point where you have taken your story, you have now gathered a higher understanding of how your story is placed in the masses, and now you're entering the stage as a storyteller, I believe that you don't just deserve the same space, but that you are very important in the researcher telling their story, their point. Because someone just talking about research is dead in the water to most people, right? Unless it's something dramatic again. It's a little bit the algorithm. Like if you have clickbait research, then obviously people are going to listen. But again, they're probably not going to catch the point of your research. But if you combine the numbers with a real lived experience somewhere inside the numbers, the audience is actually going to remember. So I think the beauty of this now is for organizations and event makers is to place us together on stage, making us playing our part instead of the researcher trying to put in a story just to make their presentation sound cooler and really failing at it, or us storytellers feeling we are forced to go and take an academic degree or a background or a course or whatever just to feel that we can be in the same room as the doctors.
Right.
Both of these things is kind of defeating the purpose. So allow us to stay in our spaces and be good at what we are doing and lean on each other's perspectives, because this is where I actually think the people hosting is responsible of doing that. So if you first check, am I just a story or am I someone's story plus a higher perspective? If I am story plus higher perspective, place me with the others. If I'm just a story, place me together with someone who represents the higher perspective, the researcher, and let us do it together. Both of these will allow the audience to actually get a richer understanding of the topic you're trying to get them to understand. That would be my not so short advice.
That was good. Haley?
No, I definitely agree with, we've created this dichotomy between lived experience and expertise. And by doing that, we're devaluing the importance of lived experience because we're assuming it's just emotional. And it's, here is an emotional ex a story that someone is sharing versus recognizing there's a ton of knowledge, and not only knowledge, but recommendations and insights and potential improvements to whatever the story is focused on for someone, whether it's, a caregiver's experience accessing support, whether it's someone's interactions with the mental health care system, whether it's the way that they were received when they went to the emergency room. Like there's all of these different examples where lived experience can be such a guiding force for making change. And if we don't give space for that side of the value of lived experience, we're missing these really innovative solutions that often can be low cost, can have a tremendous impact, and can be implemented relatively easily when we're actually listening to what is it like to navigate a system from someone who has been on the inside versus hearing the story and then assuming that all of the answers around systems development and implementation and research and all of these ideas should only come from this other external factor. And on the flip side, when we're not recognizing that many people who have expertise that we've given a lot of value to, like Jimmy mentioned, academics, clinicians, researchers, if we're not recognizing that they also share lived experience, we're not allowing them to be fully human. And we're encouraging them to wear this mask and only show up with this very specific identity where there's a chance for us to learn both can be integrated into one person, and also both belong in these bigger conversations around how do we make systems and support better. One thing I will say around caregivers and caregivers' experiences that's so critical is just giving space for caregivers and supporters in the life of someone who's struggling, the opportunity to really reflect on the intersection between their story and the person they care for. Because oftentimes those two stories are so intertwined, and making sure, they've had that conversation with their loved one. Is that person comfortable with elements of their story being shared? Like really doing that deep dive into readiness almost as a unit versus as a solo person, because sometimes there's a pressure on parents to share, this is what I experienced, this is what my child went through, this is what this person in my life has navigated, without always checking back to see what is the thought process or the comfort level of the person themselves, depending on, how old are they, what is, where are they at in their life, how much has this story been processed for the caregiver and for the person they're caregiving for. So I do think that that part is also so critical of what have been those conversations. And for organization, bringing in a storyteller, it goes back to what I said earlier of what is your intended outcome and purpose? Are you bringing someone in to share their story because you want to check a box and say, we did something for Mental Health Week. We invited someone to come in and share their story. So we did the thing and now we move on and we're continuing to ignore, what's happening within an organization? Or are we using this as a starting point for something else? Are we using that story and that space for storytelling as a chance to have conversations internally, as an opportunity to review our policies, as a chance for us to think more critically about our support structures, as a chance to, have deeper conversations with our team and start to feel safer having these dialogues about our own stories with each other. Like there needs to be story, and from my perspective, is never an end point. It's always the beginning of something else. And so identifying what it's the beginning of something else too is really important before you invite someone in to share something that's so personal to them. Know how you're going to activate that, how you're going to build momentum from that story within your organization or on your conference or whatever the venue is for that story being shared.
Okay, Jimmy, I know you wanted to say something here.
Short point, with the thousand people that have shared the story through the human aspect, the one criteria that we have, which is very positively strict but also subjective, is that they need to be in a space of reflection. They need to have moved beyond at least the toughest part of the challenge. Again, you're never going to overcome losing a child, just to put a very dramatic one out there. But you will, of course, be able to get to a point where you can share it with perspective. Because one of the challenges with lived experience, and to kind of put the other side of it as well, both that when you're in the middle of your challenge or still in the harder part of the challenge, you might still, especially in the world we live in today, where everyone wants to be heard, you might have a massive need to talk about what has gone wrong, that you haven't been listened to, that your child haven't been listened to, and so on. And the challenge of placing a lot of people within that space on a big podium is that is almost as addictive as the challenges that you're in. Plus, you might now share a very narrow point of view, because you're not going to see the challenge the same way if you move 5 years away from it. So the beauty of at least the reason why we're doing it the way that we're doing it is that we are allowing people to breathe and get some space to the challenge, to not make sure that they're too much locked into the way that they saw it in the middle of it, because our brain literally goes like this when we're in a big challenge, and then when we're out of the challenge it goes back out, if you're reflecting on it. So I think that is important as well, and something that people should ask themselves, and ask the ones they're sharing the story of, are they in a space now where it's a little bit of a while ago since it was on its most intense? That is helpful, I think, both for the person themselves, because it's a better experience, but also for getting a perspective out there that actually is more broad than just one person's story.
And as I hear and I listen to both of you, it's also in protecting the audience, their heart space, and those who are sharing. Because when people are sharing their personal stories, their lived experience, it is very real. And sometimes we ask people how you're doing, and I like to ask people how is your heart today? Because you get a pause and you get a very different response when people really sit in what they're feeling. And when we are in public spaces and arenas and we're sharing stories that can also have a traumatic effect, we never know who we're triggering. So I think one piece of advice we have to always remind those who are putting on conferences and workshops, remember to create psychological supports in those audiences. I know in events that I've curated before, depending on the topic, we have actually had psychologists in the audience. We've actually had organizations who've donated their time so that after the conversation, that if anybody is triggered, they can make a phone call. You just never know. If you have your podcasts and stuff, putting up resources, as stories are real and everybody can relate. As you said, Jimmy, earlier, when you kept asking that question, it ended up more about childhood trauma than the loss of their brother. That was the hardest thing they had to experience. And then, Haley, you spoke about caregivers and their loved ones, and I think this is a conversation we can even lead, just even do on its own, because as a caregiver myself, I can't always ask permission to share my story because it's my story. And sometimes what is happening in the world of mental health, we focus so much on the patients that because there's even so little supports for mental health caregivers, family caregivers, we're not realizing their stories are being left out. They're also seen as alienated in the story, and they're very much the first part of it. As I tell folks, family caregivers are the very first responders to their loved ones who are in crisis, no matter what the crisis is. They come home to us most times, and they leave our houses in whether if it's in crisis. So that's a whole big piece to unpack that we need to do. So as we're just about at time, I'm just going to ask you both, if you, in a nutshell, when you look to the future, what gives you the most hope about the aspect of authentic storytelling in the mental health world? What do you still believe needs to be changed? Now, if you can do that in 1 minute each or two, let's see how we do that. I know I give you a big question. What's your hope for the future?
I can go. For me, the hope for the future and the thing I talk about with my team all the time is that stories have the power to cultivate empathy. And during, times in the world where there is, like we were saying earlier, there's an agenda for how certain people want communities to be perceived. Stories are just a window that remind us that we are so much more similar than we are different. And the fact that you can get something and connect from anyone's story, that you see yourself in them, even if you have vastly different experiences, is what gives me hope that we can move forward um, in giving people the space to be able to share those honest stories so that they can inspire someone else and also so that they can see themselves reflected back through the lens of someone's story that they may not have assumed that they would connect to or relate to in some way. And the thing that's still has a long way to go, I think to the point earlier about algorithms, we're still so reliant on this kind of quick fix content. We're still trying to get people's attention. So if we can continue to move in a direction where we allow for more nuance and context and less black and white and more gray area and more for people to be flawed and human and learning rather than fully complete and linear and just kind of before and after representations of themselves, the better we will be able to see our shared humanity. So I think there's still some ways to go with a lot of the platforms that we're on, but there's a shift that's happening where more leaders are and more organizations are leaning into long form. And I think that will be helpful as we continue to build this conversation.
Yes, and I would love to build further on that, as Haley's saying as well. In a polarized world where we have never been more impacted by narratives than what we are now, in terms of measured time of the narratives physically impacting us, because it's literally following us inside our home, where propaganda back in the days couldn't really creep up in your house most of the time. We really need to connect, as Haley's saying, connect beyond the narrative, because the power of the narrative is really working subconsciously in our minds. So it's very hard to defend against. You could say that you're conscious, you could say that you are aware, you could say that, oh, I know this is right or this is wrong, but you're literally battling the biggest corporations on the planet. Do you really think that you alone is going to stand a chance? That's unrealistic. So we need the authentic storytelling to allow us to connect beyond them. Because the beauty of a true story is that the narrative kind of battered in your subconscious for years. But do you have one authentic story that breaks the messaging, the subconscious messaging of that narrative? Our brain is so beautiful that when it has one proof that the narrative is wrong, it's almost like the narrative crumbles. Because then you will have it, yeah, I hear the narrative, but, then but, and that little but space is incredibly important in today's political context, but also today's polarized world in general. And to lead on what we need to make a change for, it's leaned into the same thing. What is the most scary thing about the algorithms? I've had the pleasure of deeply understanding the algorithms. We have worked both with Meta and against Meta in many ways, and been in these kind of projects and forums for them to improve their algorithms. And that's where we got the insight to understand. Is discrimination, structural discrimination, is the basis of the colonial structures that we're living in the world right now. So I'm not going to talk my way completely out of it, but you see the same within the algorithms. Clear example, if you share a story about LGBTQ in Meta, it will
Right?
automatically be downgraded. Like it's
Yep.
just built into the algorithm. Makes no sense. They have no reason why they should be biased towards anything, because it's built in the US, and sadly the US has a conservative mindset when it comes to that. If you uplift stories from the global south, you automatically see less traction. Again, we have, as I said, we have millions of numbers and data points just from ourselves that proves the same point. So the beauty of understanding that and accepting that that's the way it is that you have the power to counter that. So we talked about earlier, talk the original story, but learn the tricks, but don't lean into the tricks of altering the story. So when you know you have a story that is automatically going to get less traction, this is where you put on your battle shoes. This is where
Right.
you ensure that you have shared it on purpose ahead. This is where you have other LBQT activists sharing your story on purpose because they want to uplift it. So you fight the algorithm, because you also know that the algorithm eventually will lean into traction. So if you manage to get enough traction on something that is automatically downgraded, it will move beyond the filter within the algorithm, because eventually it just wants us to stay there and interact, right? So it won't keep the story down long enough if you get the traction above a certain threshold. That's how the algorithm works. So this is how we have managed to get some of the stories which were banned, quote unquote, and we got massive traction on them because we did our prep work, and we were realizing that this isn't an original story. It doesn't start at 0 and then you have to go up. It starts at minus 200 and you have to get it up to 0 to even start competing. So I think this is a very interesting aspect, that where we
Yeah.
need to realize how these structures that live in our physical world is dominating the digital world. It's actually worse there, I would argue, than it is in our physical world. So I would leave all of you that you're all important pieces of making sure that the algorithm is trained, that we care about these topics that the masters of the algorithm has suppressed.
Thank you so much, Jimmy and Haley. This has been an enriching conversation, so much to learn. And I think even out of just hearing the wrap ups, I could see the conversations that we can build in the eMHIC space and really cultivate some great conversation. Understanding there's significant credibility in sharing the lived experience of those living with their mental health being compromised and the caregivers. Our stories matter. It is important that we honor the stories of those around us, the storytellers, and dignity is key. especially as they share their own personal stories and as people come forth with courage. It's not easy to share your story. And when we look to shape solutions to policies, to systems, and to create better solutions in the mental health world, we need to have the true voices of the end user, is which are those people with the lived experience. People can say whatever they want to say, but there would be no jobs in the mental health space if you didn't have somebody dealing with their compromised mental health and you didn't have a caregiver taking care of them. So they must be included in your conversations. We have to engage and partner and collaborate when it comes to the algorithms and learn from one another and share authentically. When you hear about webinars like this, share it. If you find a tip, share it with somebody you know in your organization. Don't just leave it that I came here. You got to walk away with, serious action plans and not just relying on data. So many organizations are relying on data to drive what their decisions that they make. But the voice of those who have lived experience, it matters and it has the impact. And so we encourage you here to make sure and you include that lived experience. And when you are doing your conferences, your workshops, please do not stick them in corners. Do not put them in places where it's the bad time slot, where it's right after lunch and people are tired. Put it in spaces where people need to really learn and hear them. And remember, and I know this is something that we talked on and we couldn't really get to deeply, it's privilege. Academia working from privilege. And there is a space where those who are in institutions and organizations, you are sitting in that place of privilege and you have an opportunity to include people with their lived experience. It is actually an honor when you can bring somebody to the table and treat them with dignity and don't, say, come and look at something that you've already curated. It is time to do really authentic collaborations, and that's where things matter. And so I know you had other takeaways, and I'm going to encourage you to share your takeaways with us. Put it on social media. Send us an email. I'm hoping that most of you have signed up for our eMHIC newsletter. And thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you in our next webinar. Take care.